Hello and welcome to the second video in this 3D object detection series. In the previous video, Grace showed how you can explore and pre-process point cloud data. The next step in training an object detector is to get a labeled dataset. And in this video, we are going to talk about how you can label point clouds using the LiDAR Labeler app. Now let's switch to MATLAB. Before I open the Labeler app, there's something else that I have to do first, which is to split the data into training and test folders. This is important for deep learning so that we can train and evaluate the detector, but it will be explained in more detail in the next video where we look at training object detectors. Here, I'm going to split the data that was saved in the parking lot edit folder in the previous video, and I'm going to split it into parking lot train and parking lot test. And this snippet of code does that. So let me go and run this one. Now that this is done, if we go back to the previous level, you can see that a parking lot test and a train data set was created. Now we can start labeling by using the LiDAR Labeler app. So I'm going to open it by going to the Apps tab and choosing the LiDAR Labeler. You can also open LiDAR Labeler by typing LiDAR Labeler in the command window. Now that the LiDAR Labeler is open, we're going to start by importing our dataset. You can use the import option here and add your point clouds. And since we have saved it in a file, I'm going to choose the from file option. Ours is a point cloud sequence, and I'm going to browse to the location that we have all our PCD files stored. And this is going to be the train folder that we just created.
And this is why we separate the data into train and test ahead of time, is so that the labels correspond to our training and test set when we get into deep learning later.
Yeah. And before I hit OK, you might have noticed that there are other options too for you to import your data. This is similar to the LiDAR Viewer app where you had multiple options to import your files from. And the same options are available in the Labeler app as well. So I'm going to click OK to import the data. It'll take a few seconds to load your data into the app. Once it's loaded, you can see it right over here that shows the data set. The data set consists of multiple frames, so you can see that it runs from a start time of 0 to about 7 minutes of data. With the data loaded into the app, you can start exploring the data again by using the options over here. So you have rotate, pan, and zoom option. So again, this is very similar to the LiDAR Viewer app, and you have the same options, including a lot of preset views that you can choose. So you can go to a YZ view or a XY view, which is more of a top-down view. And you also have an XZ view. And you can restore your camera to the default view once you have explored all the other views. There's also regions that you can select. So if you want to focus on a small area of your frame, you can use the select ROI button here to basically crop your data. But since we had already done this in the previous video, we're going to skip this option for now. But if you want to crop your data further, you can still use the options here to set the limits and get the data to a position that you want it.
And it looks like you can either use numeric limits or you can drag to see what
you can also drag the sliders here to adjust the boundaries of your crop. So I'm going to close this one. Now that we have explored all the preset views and the cropping options that we have, we can start labeling by clicking on the label section here. First, we need to add some label definitions. Here, we are going to be labeling barrels, which are construction barrels, and then we are also going to be labeling vehicles and cones. So I'm going to start by defining a barrel label. So I'm going to click on the label here and give it a name. I'm just going to call it barrel, which is going to be a cuboid of color green. We have other options as well, a line and a voxel, but since cuboid fits our needs best, I'm going to go with cuboid. You can see that a barrel label has been created. So to label it, I'm first going to adjust the view so that I can see the barrels. I'm going to increase the point size a little bit so it's a little bit more brighter and easy to see. To start labeling, you can click on the label, which is the barrel here, and I'm going to hover over the barrel that I see. And you can see that the keyboard option right now is pretty big. So to reduce the size, you can press on Shift and A and then scroll in or out to make it smaller or larger.
Nice.
So even though I reduced the size, it still shrunk to the size of the points around the barrel. And this is because I have the option set to shrink to fit. And I could also set it to snap to cluster, which would snap to a cluster of points. And there are other options like auto align as well. But shrink to fit does work pretty well. And in this case, it is a little smaller because the points in itself are pretty small. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to zoom in and I'm going to adjust the labels manually so that it captures the points well. I can do that by clicking on the label and dragging it in the axis that you want.
Nice.
So this one seems to capture all the points appropriately. So I'm going to keep this label. And you can do the same thing for the next one. Again, this time I'll use snap to cluster to see how that would look like. And click on the barrel to see how it labels. So it does do considerably better at this for this barrel, but again, these options vary depending on the density of your object. So if you have like a really dense objects, then maybe shrink to fit is better. But you have a little sparse objects, a cluster might do a better job. So you'll have to play around based on what kind of points you have for the objects you're trying to detect.
Now, you used a couple keyboard shortcuts for, both changing the size of the labels, moving around. There's a whole bunch of shortcuts in this app, right?
Yeah. So the Labeler app gives you a lot of shortcuts so that it makes it easier and faster for you to navigate and label the data. If you go back to the label section, you see a view shortcuts button. I'm going to click on that. And that shows you all the shortcuts that are available in the app.
Awesome.
Again, we have this barrel labeled, but the label sizes are not exactly consistent. And for deep learning, we want to make sure that the label sizes are as consistent as possible. So one thing you can do is, once you have a label that you're happy with, you can also copy the same thing and paste it again. So the new label is superimposed by the old one. So what we're going to do is just hold it and then hold Shift and move it over to the next barrel.
And you can also copy labels from frame to frame. So, we're detecting the same object, these same barrels for several frames. So you can copy that over into the next frame and make some small adjustments as well.
Yeah. So I'm going to actually rotate and go back to a view that I like. And I think I'm going to save this view because it makes it easier to get back when we are working with a large data set which has multiple frames. And if there's a particular view that you like, it makes a lot of sense to save it. So what I'm going to do is go to a location that I like. And I'm going to click on camera view and choose save camera view. And I'm going to call this barrel view because I'm going to use it to label barrels.
It's our good barrel view.
Yeah.
So we've labeled about 3 barrels in one of our frames, but we have a little over 800 frames of data, right? Like, how can I streamline this process?
Yeah. Unfortunately, labeling your data set does take a lot of time. It's probably the one that takes the most time in the object detector workflow. But the Lidar Labeler app does give you some options to make it faster. So if we go over to the label section here, you can see there is an automate labeling section in this tool strip. And what this allows you is to automate some of the labeling process, so you don't have to manually click on each barrel or each object that you're interested in. So let's begin by labeling the same barrels that we just did, but for the next frame. So if I switch to the next frame. I'm going to go back and choose the view that I like, which is the bevel view. And I'm going to go back to the label section and try to automate this part of labeling. Let's focus on the first barrel. If you click on select algorithm, there are multiple algorithms that you can use. The first one is using a pre-trained model. So if you already have a pre-trained model or a model that you worked on in a previous project that can also detect barrels, you can import that to detect some of the barrels. You can also create your own custom automation function. There's also an object tracker that is really useful. And the last one is a point cloud temporal interpolator, which interpolates the labels between two labeled frames. So if you have the first and the fifth frame labeled, it's going to interpolate where the label will be for the second, third, and fourth frames. For this, I'm going to use the point cloud temporal interpolator. So let me click on that. And once I've chosen that, I'm going to have to choose a region in which I want to automate. So what I'm going to do is adjust these red flags that you see here. I'm going to pause it here because I just saw that it crossed the barrel completely. I'm going to go back a few frames to make sure I don't miss any partially visible frames. So let me pan again. I mean, right away you can see that the objects are much denser because the car has gotten much closer to the barrel.
And we can still see that first barrel in this frame.
Yeah. So if I go again, this is like the last frame in which the first barrel was fully visible, and the next frame has something of the barrel cut out. The next frame, you can't really tell that's a barrel based on just a 4 point. So I'm gonna stop it right here and get the flag to where my frame is. So this is the region in which we are going to be automating. So I'm going to go back to the first frame. So if you use this button, it'll go back to the start of the flag. And now we can go back to the label section again and click on automate. So this brings you to the automation section. Here, like I had mentioned before, the temporal interpolator requires you to have some frames labeled so that it can interpolate the labels for all the frames in between. So what I'm going to do is label the first frame, and since we are focusing on the first barrel, I'll label that one. So now I have the first barrel label. I'm actually going to copy this, and then we're going to move the slider away to a different location.
Now it's worth noting that, like you said, it's going to interpolate between two labels, and we have a few different directions in our video because the car is taking the turn and then we move forward. So it can be helpful to add a few extra labels, not just at the beginning or at the end, but anytime there's a change in momentum or direction, then even if you're labeling it every few frames, every handful of frames, you're still saving a lot of time on that interpolation. But we're going to add more than just two in this interpolation because it covers a lot of frames.
Yeah, it is always good if you have more frames, because more labeled frames, because that helps the interpolator to get a better accuracy on its automation. Now I've gone ahead to a different frame. I'm going to paste. I'm going to use Control V to paste the label that we just copied. So you can see that in the previous frame the label was here, but now it has moved to this location. So I'll have to manually adjust that, move it across.
And copying and pasting means that the labels are going to be the same size.
Exactly. Now I'll just repeat the process to label a few more frames in the selected region. And then I'll label the last frame to ensure that the first and last are labeled, and we also have a bunch of intermediate frames labeled as well. So this one, the label size is going to reduce a little bit because it's only partially visible. So I'm going to adjust the label size to reflect that. Alright, so we have labeled a few intermediate frames. So now let's go back to the beginning. Right, now that we can see the barrels, I'm going to click on run so that you can run the automation algorithm and start labeling the frames that we missed out. Great, now that the algorithm has finished running, let's go back to the beginning and see how it did. We can go by frame to see how the labels look.
And you can see frames that we didn't label now have labels.
And the labels look pretty good, but if there are some labels that are a little off, we recommend that you go ahead and adjust it and make sure that the labels are consistent. And again, this is a recommended workflow. Anytime you do an automation, you have to manually make sure all the labels look good. Since right now I like what I'm seeing, I'm going to accept the changes. And then if you see here, if I go back to the first frame where I labeled 3 of them, but not the first one, and if I go to the second one, this is the automation algorithm labeling. But one important thing to note here is that the temporal interpolator can only interpolate one object. So if you want to label 4 barrels like we have here, you'll have to run it 4 different times. So that's how we can use the labeler app to quickly label your data set. So once you have labeled all your data, so in this scenario, we're going to be labeling barrels, vehicles, and cones. But if you have labeled all of them, what you can do is export these labels to the workspace or to a file. So if you go back to the label section, there's an export option that you can use. And like I said, you have a file option or workspace option. For this, I'm going to be using the workspace, and I'll just name it gtruth partial because I haven't fully labeled the data set. And this will export all your data to the workspace. So if I switch back, you can see that a gtruth partial was created.
Nice. And like Abhishek said, we know that this can take some time, so you can also save your work as you go.
Yeah. So if you go back to the labeler app, here you can see that there's an option to save session. So you can save whatever you have done so far and give it a name. Let's call it LiDAR labeling session. And that would save it in your current folder. So the next time you come back to it, you can just go back to the labeler app and then choose open session to open the session that you just saved. So in this video, we saw how to label a few objects using the LiDAR labeler app, but we also have the whole dataset labeled, and I'm going to import the labels to show you how that looks like. So I'm going to click on import labels, and I'm going to do it from workspace. So this will overwrite whatever we have currently done, and that is okay. And it's going to ask for what variable to choose, and we have gtruth. I'll click OK. Great. Now that the new labels have loaded, let's see how all of them look. So you can see that all the barrels are labeled. So if I just move ahead, you can see they've been labeled for every frame. And let's skip forward a bit to see some other options, like a car that was labeled. And this way you can just play around with the data set and then move forward and see all the different data that was labeled.
And you'll see that, sometimes there's an object that maybe we know is there, but the points aren't there because it's blocked by a tree or something, and those aren't labeled. So I've just labeled the objects that have enough points to be detected and identified.
Yeah, and that is important because if you label something that the LiDAR can't see, then the object detector is going to think that an empty space means that's a car or that's a cone, which is obviously bad news.
So you'll have to play around with what you do label and what you don't label in terms of how many points are in that object.
Yeah. To recap, in this video we saw how you can label data using the LiDAR labeler app. You can use the automation algorithm to automate some of the labelings, which saves a lot of time. And you can then export the labeled data set to the workspace or to a file and use that for your next steps in the object detection series. A few more resources that can be useful are listed in the slide here.